Story 1. The first night in this place was strange, but not so strange that I suspected that it would be the beginning of a nightmare. I was used to new places. I was always traveling, staying in hotels, motels, always looking for a place to wait out, to recuperate. This hotel seemed like nothing special, and I didn't expect anything supernatural. At least, not until I heard a knock. When I first arrived, everything seemed normal. The hotel was old but well kept, with a threadbare carpet in the lobby and wooden stairs that creaked slightly underfoot. The attention to detail was noticeable. Old paintings on the walls, massive furniture, and even the soft light from dim lamps creating a cozy atmosphere. At the time, it didn't seem like there was anything dark about the place, but I still felt something strange in the air, as if there was something about the building that didn't match its appearance. I checked into one of the rooms on the third floor, a simple room with one large bed, an old TV, and an even older desk that looked like it hadn't been used for years. As I settled in and opened the window to air out the room, I noticed the horizon was getting darker, and a strange feeling of loneliness washed over me. Nothing out of the ordinary, of course, just another night in an unfamiliar place. However, when night fell and I lay down in bed, I suddenly heard a knock that immediately put me on my guard. It was not like the knock that comes from neighbors' doors or random sounds in the walls, but something completely different, deep, slow, and hollow. I froze. It was far away, as if someone was knocking on the wall, but with the feeling that there was something in this knock. I waited a few seconds, listening, but the knock was repeated. 2 knocks, deep and measured, then a pause, 2 more knocks. I couldn't explain why, but I felt uneasy. It wasn't the kind of knocking that I could ignore. It was something else. It seemed like just the sounds of an old building, but I knew they couldn't be normal. I turned over in bed, trying to calm myself. It must have been some kind of noise that just happened to be in an old hotel, but somehow the thought that it might be something strange wouldn't leave me. My whole body tensed like a spring when I heard it again, louder this time, and then I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and headed for the door. No, I wasn't a particularly superstitious person, but now I was curious. Maybe it was something as mundane as an old elevator that wasn't working properly, or maybe one of the other guests had dropped something on the floor. It all seemed like a reasonable explanation. I walked to the door, bearing my nerves, and listened. The knocking continued. I lifted the door handle and opened it a little, expecting to see only an empty hallway, as always. However, when I looked in, there was nothing. An empty hallway, as I expected. The light flickered dimly, creating that very atmosphere that makes you feel uneasy, like you are in some forgotten corner of the world. I was ready to close the door and go back to bed, but then I noticed something strange. On the floor, right next to the door frame, lay a card, an ordinary playing card. I bent down to pick it up, and for a second I thought it might have fallen out of someone's map, accidentally forgotten by someone. But when I touched it, I felt a chill run through my fingers. It was strangely cold, as if it had been in the freezer for a long time, and not just cold, but frighteningly cold, as if it were on its own. I picked up the card and looked at it. The Ace of Spades. The Ace of Spades that seemed so innocuous, but when I looked at it at that moment, I felt goosebumps run across my skin. It shouldn't be there. I didn't know why, but I felt that this card was more than just a playing card. Strange, wasn't it? But something about that feeling made me pick it up as if it was drawing me. I couldn't explain what made me pick it up, but I knew exactly what was wrong with the object. The light in the hallway suddenly flickered, and I felt the strange movement in the air again. I turned sharply toward the door, and for a moment I thought I saw it, something moving in the darkness beyond the doorway. It wasn't a creature, not a person. It was a shadow. It was tall and writhing, as if it had no real form, just a shadow. I felt my heart skip a beat. A moment, and I was back in my room, slamming the door as hard as I could. A second, and I leaned against it, as if moving away from something invisible, something scary that had just passed through the hallway. I stood there in complete silence until I felt my hands begin to shake. I leaned against the wall, clutching the map, trying to catch my breath. My head was racing with thoughts. What was that? Just a mind trick? I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I was far from safe, and this was just the beginning. The knocking came again, but now I knew it wasn't just a sound, it was a call. and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't understand what was happening. The room was dark, and I was trying to find an explanation for what had happened in the last few minutes. Lying in bed, I tried to calm myself down, to convince myself that this was just my mind playing a trick on me. But this feeling, the pressure in the air, as if the hotel itself was breathing, wouldn't go away. Even when I tried to close my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. I couldn't sleep again. Some time passed, but I couldn't figure out how to explain it all. There was a slight noise in the hallway, a kind of creaking, as if someone was moving in the dark. I got up to check, but standing in the darkness of my room, it became obvious to me that I couldn't just ignore all of this. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't just up and leave. I was bound by this place, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that these were just night terrors, that something in this hotel was not right. The knock came again. This time it was even louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming not only from outside, but also from somewhere inside, as if the walls themselves were making the sound. I froze, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was no longer just sounds from behind the door. I came closer to it and carefully opened it. The hallway was silent. The empty, dark hallway, so familiar to me, had become somehow alien. The doors that had seemed ordinary before now looked threatening. I took a step outside. My gaze scanned the hallway, but I saw nothing. It seemed as if I had just been in a different place. Again, there was a strange feeling, as if this hallway had changed while I was standing in the room. There was a vague sense that its length had increased, as if the walls had changed their appearance. I took a step further, and again, a playing card on the floor, right where I had left the ace of spades. But now there was not one card on it, but two. The ace of spades and another one, the ace of hearts. I felt my heart beat faster. This couldn't be a coincidence. This was a sign of something to come. Maybe I was just panicking, but the strange feeling didn't go away. I bent down to pick up the cards. They were so cold that even touching them was unpleasant. As soon as I raised them, it happened again. The shadow. It was there. Before I could even blink, it was in front of me, tall and dim. It was standing at the other end of the hallway, but it wasn't the same. It seemed to be moving toward me, and with each step it got closer and closer, as if it wasn't just in this hallway, but a part of it. I could feel it, like a cold sensation spreading through my body. My back tensed, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to get back to my room again, but as soon as I reached the door, it closed with a sound like something huge had hit it from the other side. It was so unexpected that I didn't even have time to come to my senses. The room was still the same, but now the walls looked as if they were pulsating, or maybe I was just going crazy. I didn't know. I felt more and more like my thoughts were falling apart, like I was losing control of what was happening. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't coming from behind the door. It was in my head. The sounds of the knocking seemed so bright and loud that I thought someone was standing right behind me. It was fast, unlike anything I'd ever heard, fast as if someone was rushing through space, literally hammering commands into my head. "Play!" the knock seemed to whisper, as if the hotel itself wanted to force me to play some game I didn't understand. I stood there, shocked, afraid to move, and in that moment I realized I was not alone. This hotel, it was not an ordinary building, it was alive. It was part of this game, and maybe I was involved in it. My legs moved as if by themselves. I wanted to go back to my room, but I stood in the empty hallway, feeling it stretch more and more. I saw the doors changing, the distance between them growing, as if something invisible was leading me forward. But I knew I shouldn't go. I had to stop. But where should I go? This hotel was a labyrinth, and I was lost in it. And then, in the midst of these thoughts, I heard it again, that laughter. It was low, strange, as if it was coming from somewhere deep within the heart of the building, a laughter that seemed so real that I felt it seeping into me. It wasn't human. It wasn't something I would encounter in my normal life. I froze, holding my breath, and felt this laughter seem to follow me, filling the emptiness around me. All I wanted was to get out of here, but the walls of this place, its shadows and laughter, did not let me go, as if they were beckoning me to play. I didn't know what was next, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to play. Night came again, and with it the same ominous noise, that knocking that I could no longer perceive as something ordinary. It was not just noise. It was a warning, a call to play. The further I went, the stronger its effect became. It no longer sounded only in the corridor. It penetrated every part of my body, every thought, every movement. Something inside me began to crumble. I felt fear gripping me, but there was something more to it. Not just fear, but something like a wild instinct for survival. I didn't know what was smarter, to stay or to try to get out. Every night I faced that choice. Fear kept me in this place, forcing me to stay and face what lurked in the shadows. And at the same time, I knew that if I left, perhaps worse would await me. I stood in the hallway, listening. My hand reluctantly reached for the door handle. It was cold, but not as cold as the air around me. I couldn't understand why, but the whole atmosphere had become unbearably heavy. Every step I took seemed useless, unknown, making me feel like I was moving not through space, but through some other dimension. When I opened the door, I expected to see an empty corridor, but I saw something different. The corridor I knew suddenly became different, much longer than before, darker and frighteningly uninviting. Some strange stains, not like usual, were spreading along the walls, on the floor. These stains were black, as if burned by some kind of fire, and it seemed to me that they were moving, that they were not just stains, but living creatures. I took a step forward, feeling something invisible pulling me into this corridor. I couldn't turn back. It was as if the space itself resisted my attempt to return. I continued walking, despite the feeling that this corridor would never end. And there they were again, more playing cards. Again they were lying on the floor. I bent down to pick them up and discovered that this time they weren't just cards. Each one, in addition to the usual suits, had something written on it, as if they weren't just cards to play with, but some kind of instructions, directions that I had to understand. And as soon as I picked them up, everything around me seemed to slow down. The shadow, it was there again, and it wasn't just standing at the end of the hallway, it was moving toward me, knowing full well that I couldn't leave. It was dark, almost liquid, as if it had no shape and was darkness itself. The closer it got, the more I could see the smell coming from it, cold, rotten, like the smell of abandoned earth. I knew that this shadow wasn't just part of the hotel, it was something more. I tried to approach the door, but again noticed that it had disappeared. Instead, a new path opened up before me, narrow, dark, almost non-existent. It seemed that the walls of the hotel were changing. They were not just hiding me, but as if they had locked me in. And I realized that this corridor would not only not finish its trajectory, but would continue its game with me. I felt it, the laughter. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated inside. It came from all directions, through the walls, through the floor, through the air. I knew it wasn't just noise. It was something alive, something old and familiar. It was in this place, and that meant I was part of it. I was part of this game. Now, standing in this place, I realized I could no longer be just a spectator. I was already in the middle of this nightmare. I found myself part of the game, part of this terrible reality in which there was nothing to expect except pain and fear. The game had begun, but its rules were unclear. The corridor darkened again, and I felt its walls begin to shrink, as if they were actually alive. They were moving towards me, as if they were going to swallow me up. I ran, but the further I ran, the more this strange shadow pursued me. It was on my way, and it already knew that I couldn't escape. I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn around. I tried to look for a way out, but there was none. I myself became part of this labyrinth, and at the moment when I felt my breathing becoming more and more difficult, I realized that this hotel was not just a place. It was a trap built on fear, and with every step I took, I became more and more a prisoner of this place. The knocking came again, but this time it wasn't just a knocking. It was in my head, it was in my thoughts, and I could feel it making me move. It was telling me where to go, what to do, and I couldn't resist it. I was lost. I couldn't think. I couldn't act. I had become part of a game, and now I was just a pawn on this terrible field. The game was in full swing, and I was forced to play. Chapter 4, The Labyrinth of Fear. Each step became heavier, as if I were moving through a thick, viscous substance that was pulling me, holding me, not allowing me to breathe. I was trapped, a trap created by the very walls of this hotel. Once in its dark depths, I could no longer understand where I was or how much time had passed. The world around me became more and more alien, more and more unreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that this hotel wasn't just a place. It was an entity, a living organism, feeding off the fear and torment and misery of its guests. When I tried to remember how I'd gotten here, it seemed to slip away like sand through my fingers. All I knew was that I was here, and I needed to get out. But in this place, the faster you tried to escape, the faster you found yourself in an even more hopeless situation. I found myself in front of a door again, a door that was not the one I had seen a few minutes ago, and it led into a dark corridor that did not exist in the hotel I had come to. Every place here seemed alien to itself. I opened the door, but instead of the corridor I expected, there was a staircase, dark, narrow, leading into a black abyss. There was no light. I felt my hand reaching for the railing. It was instinctive, like I had to do something to survive. But I didn't know what. I stepped onto the first step. It was cold, like wrought iron, and I immediately felt goosebumps running down my spine. The stairs began to move. I couldn't believe my eyes, but they were changing. I could feel them bending, as if each step beneath me was changing its position. I tried to stop, but it was like I was in a dark dream in which movement was inevitable. The low, raspy voice was in my head again. It sounded like it was inside me, not from behind the doors, not from the shadows. No, that voice was here, in my head, telling me that I needed to keep going. "You play," the voice whispered, "and you can't stop." I forced myself to walk. Each step became heavier. Each step was terrifying. Soon I realized that the stairs did not lead down as I thought. No, on the contrary, they pulled me higher and higher into the darkness, into the unknown, and I could not find a way back. I could not even turn around. The walls around me began to bend and shrink, as if they too were part of this living organism that did not want to let me go. But when I finally reached the top, I found myself in another corridor, a corridor that had no end. I stood in the center of it, and everything around me changed again. What was behind me was gone. Now the corridor was even longer, even darker. I felt the air thickening, its heaviness penetrating my lungs. It was quiet here, and this silence was frightening. I walked a few steps, looking around, and then I realized that I was not alone. Shadows began to move around me, sneaking up from around corners, moving in the corners, even on the ceiling. I was surrounded, and no matter how much I tried to move, no matter how much I tried to get away, the steps only led me further into this labyrinth, which confused me more and more. A game. It was a game, and I was back in the middle of it. I knew the rules were changing with every moment. Everything was changing around me, and I couldn't find a way out. Suddenly I heard a noise, footsteps, but not mine. Gradually the sounds grew louder. The footsteps became faster, heavier. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of something big, something alien, something that shouldn't be there. I stopped, frozen in place, trying to figure out where they were coming from. The shadows in the corners began to move faster. They grew longer, and their outlines became clearer. They weren't just dark spots. I saw shapes, huge and twisted, moving toward me. And then, out of the darkness, it came. Not a man, not a creature. It was something that could not be named. Its outline was human, but at the same time not very human. It was something that collected all the horrors I felt when I encountered this hotel. His face was blurry, indistinct, like it had no shape, but I knew it was watching me. I felt it seeping into me, into my every thought, into my every memory. It was there. I tried to back away, but the walls were closing in, as if they were part of this thing. The shadow came to me, and I realized that it wasn't going to kill me. No, it was going to make me become part of this game, become one of its players. I felt the air grow thicker. The shadow straightened up, and now it was right in front of me. But it did not move. It waited. The game had finally entered its final stage. I was ready, but for what? I didn't know how much time had passed. Hours seemed to have disappeared in this place, as did all of reality. Every moment was an eternity, every breath a feat, and every step a step into endless darkness. The walls continued to move around me, and I could no longer be sure of what was in front of me. The shadow still stood before me, like an invisible border between this world and what was hidden beyond it. There was no pain, there was no fear, only emptiness. This was not what I expected. I was prepared for horrific creatures, for darkness, but what was before me had no form. It existed as something that manipulated reality, distorted it. No matter how hard I tried to comprehend what was happening, everything around me was disappearing into an abyss where nothing existed except this empty, distorted space. The shadow raised its hand, thin, long, as if it did not belong to this world. It reached out slowly toward me, and I felt its coldness penetrate me as time froze around me. I tried to move away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I felt hands reaching for my soul, tearing out everything that was still alive, and that sound, low, frightening, like the breath of darkness itself, kept ringing in my head. Suddenly I heard it. Laughter. Not the kind of laugh I'd heard before. It was the kind of laugh that made my insides clench, as if something deep within the hotel was coming to life, ready to devour me. But it wasn't just a laugh, it was a whisper. You were a choice. A voice in my head whispered, but you didn't choose. I didn't know what it meant. How could I make a choice? I stood before this creature, not understanding what was required of me. Suddenly it became clear to me that the game, this terrible, twisted game, had never had a rule. It was not the creator of its own world. It was the result of what we, all of us who were here, had once chosen. My gaze fell on the old playing card I had found that night when it all began, the ace of spades. There it was again, and I knew. There was no chance in this game. Everything was predetermined, every step, every moment. It was like a chessboard on which we were all pawns, unaware that we were being driven not just by fear, but by our own decision. The shadow took another step toward me. Now I could see its shape. It was something huge, writhing like fog, but inside that fog was something bigger. I realized it hadn't come here to destroy me. It was part of this world. It was what was waiting for me, part of the hotel. I felt my legs begin to move. I had no control over them, but they were moving forward and I couldn't stop them. I was approaching the shadow. My steps were slow, not because I didn't want to walk, but because something was preventing me from doing so quickly. I approached the shadow and it seemed to tighten around me, enveloping me, wrapping me. And in that moment I understood. There was no death in this place. There was no end. There was no beginning. This was the place where those who play go, where you lose yourself but remain forever. The shadow slowly dissolved and I felt the cold embrace my body, squeezing it in its paws. I couldn't run. I couldn't close my eyes. I was with this world, and it was with me. The game was over, and I was no longer me. Concluding the game didn't free me. Instead, I became part of something bigger. Time stopped, and I found myself in a place where time wasn't needed, where all that mattered was staying in the game and playing until you became part of it. Story 2. It took me a long time to get used to this house, but I could not love it. When I first moved here, everything seemed new and strange. I chose this house because it was close to work, in a small but quite quiet area, and, at first glance, was perfect for a single person like me. My friends always said that I was lucky. Seriously, this is one of those cases when you want to leave your apartment and immediately get into a comfortable house, as what they said when I showed them the photo. But for me, living here for a few months now, the house has become more empty than comfortable. I liked being alone, not having anyone pestering me with requests, not having any obligations. Free time had been a rarity for me in the last few years, and I could relax whenever I wanted and get lost in my thoughts without worrying about how anyone was looking at me. Everything I ever wanted I got here. And yet, at times, I felt like I was missing something important, maybe something I hadn't noticed before. When I lived with my parents, the house was, without exaggeration, majestic, with high ceilings and spacious rooms that seemed to lack furniture. I filled every corner with large, comfortable chairs, bookshelves, and tried several times to fill the space with large paintings, but there was still some emptiness that gnawed at me. I decided that I was simply not used to loneliness and that it would pass. There was another thing that bothered me. I rarely visited my parents. Although my relationship with them was good, I still couldn't forget how often my mother had called me in recent years, asking me to come over. I always put it off. There wasn't enough time, work was mounting, and I couldn't justify the need for such long visits. With each passing year, it became more and more difficult to talk to them, especially my mother. Her calls became more and more insistent, even strange. She would ask questions that didn't make sense. "You remember that I always waited for you, right?" Or, "Do you remember how we used to pick apples in the orchard?" At these moments, I always felt awkward and broke off the conversation. I thought it was just old age and nervous tension, and then I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I came home late from work, thinking about how tomorrow would be the same day again. Computer, code, bug fixes, work calls, and home again. I wasn't particularly tired, but the feeling of emptiness wouldn't go away. Not for the first time, I felt like this house had become somehow cramped for me. It was too big for one person, and the longer I stayed here, the less I wanted to return to its walls after work. That evening, as usual, I was walking down the long hallway looking at all the rooms. I always looked into each one before turning off the lights. Maybe it was just habit, but that time, as I passed the old closet in the bedroom, I suddenly felt that something was wrong. I stopped. Nothing special, of course. Just a small gust of wind, a draft from an open window, but the feeling that something or someone was watching me did not go away. I shook my head, condemning myself for fantasizing, and decided not to pay attention to it. I went into the kitchen and made myself dinner. When everything was ready, I sat down at the table. From the window, I could see the night quietly descending on the city, and almost at that moment I heard a strange sound, faint but distinct. It was some kind of rustling, as if someone was moving in the room next door. I froze. At first, I thought it was just my ears, or maybe I was just tired. But then I heard it again, in the bedroom. I stood up, still not understanding what was happening. The anxiety, gradually growing, made me go out into the corridor. I slowly approached the room from which the noise seemed to be coming. I opened the door, and it was quiet. No rustling, no movement. It was strange. I felt stupid again. Probably just the creaking of old wood, I thought, and decided to go back to my room. But something happened at that moment. As I turned to close the door, I felt a gaze, as if someone was watching me. It was a strange and cold sensation, as if the air around me froze, and for a moment the whole house was in shadow. I couldn't explain why, but I felt creepy. I quickly slammed the door and went back to my room. Although something inside me continued to disturb me, I still tried to calm down. The night was quiet, and I again plunged into my thoughts, forgetting about the strange sensations. But perhaps this was just the beginning. Every day it became harder and harder to ignore the strange sensations in the house. Everything seemed normal at first glance. Evening, night, and again the same familiar order. I return from work, cook dinner, watch TV, and finally go to bed. But I began to notice things that I could not explain. The first thing that caught my attention was the light. Sometimes, when I woke up at night, my eyes would automatically move around the room, and I would see a dim light flickering in the corner of the room. Not bright, but noticeable enough to attract attention. It was always there, in the corner where the old wooden cabinet stood. I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe it was the reflected light from the street or some glare from the neighbors, but why had I never noticed it before? And why, when I got closer, the light disappeared? One night I decided to check it out. I stood up quietly, tiptoed to the corner, but as expected, the light disappeared as soon as I opened my eyes. I went to the window and looked outside to see if the neighbors had any bright lamps or lights on, but everything was dark. No reflections, no external light sources. I stood by the window, feeling a little stupid, but at the same time I couldn't shake this strange feeling of anxiety that was tormenting me. After that I became more attentive to what was happening in the house. I paid attention to sounds that I had previously ignored. Light steps, as if someone was moving around the room. Noises, as if someone was moving furniture or rustling on the floor. At first, I thought that these were sounds created by the old walls, but at some point it became clear that they were coming from one specific place, from that very, not right away, but I began to notice how it creaked a little at night, as if someone was trying to open it, although I could not understand why I had not noticed this before. I even tried to open the closet, but I didn't find anything strange. It was empty, as always. My things were neatly laid out on the shelves, and nothing looked out of the ordinary. But that creaking, that persistent rustling that came from inside was unbearable. At some point, I began to think that I was just making it up, that these strange sensations were a consequence of the stress that had accumulated over the past months. However, one morning I woke up with the feeling that the night had not passed peacefully. I got out of bed as usual, but immediately felt that something was wrong. The weather was strange, as was everything around. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but there was some invisible, heavy smell in the air. I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My eyes were dark, tired, but when I looked closely at my reflection, it seemed to me that it was a little distorted. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe I was too tired, but I clearly felt that something inside me had changed, too. It was a feeling that I was no longer in control of the situation. The day went on, and I tried not to think about what was happening. I went to work, but even on the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was as if a hidden shadow was following me, even though I couldn't see it. I tried to concentrate on my work, but returning home couldn't help but disturb me. All these vague feelings accumulated and became heavy, like an unbearable burden. One evening I came home and didn't immediately notice anything strange. I put my bag down, turned on the light, and started to heat up dinner. But something was wrong in this house. It was as if it was filled with something dark and heavy. I shrank and felt cold. The strange feeling did not leave me. I went to the nearest store, bought an air freshener to get rid of the damp and musty smell that seemed to bother me. When I returned, the smell was gone, but the anxiety remained. I stood in front of the same closet in the bedroom again, trying to channel the strange feelings that filled me into something tangible. But inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind the closet, that it wasn't just a closet anymore. For a moment, I thought I could get rid of it, throw it away, but then I thought that would be too stupid. My hand shook as I opened the door again and peered inside. Again, nothing, just emptiness and shelves. But then I realized what was happening. All this weirdness wasn't a coincidence. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, and if I didn't start paying attention to its signals, it would just consume me. The first few days, full of strange occurrences, gradually developed into a feeling that the house was not just keeping its secrets, but playing with them. I began to lose my sense of reality, trying to figure out what was happening around me. The signs of a presence in the house were becoming more and more numerous, and it was becoming impossible to ignore them. The feeling that I was not alone was disappearing and returning, and the sounds of the night were now haunting me. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen trying to concentrate on a task, I thought I heard a rustling sound. It was almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to make me turn my head. My eyes scanned the room briefly, but as always, I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Deciding that it was the wind again, or the old pipes, I returned to my thoughts. However, the feeling that something was wrong became more distinct. I went out onto the balcony to get some fresh air, and that's when I felt it, that gaze. It was like someone was standing right behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one. I froze, feeling the blood drained from my face. My heart began to beat faster. I tried to rationalize the sensations. It's just nervousness, I told myself. Maybe it's just my imagination processing stress, but the more I tried to explain it, the more obvious it became that there was something more to my attempts to find logic. I returned to the house, and after a while I heard that strange sound again, which now seemed much clearer to me. It was not just the creaking of the old floor or cracks in the walls. No, it was the sound of someone trying to move slowly and carefully in the hallway. I did not know what to do, but I could no longer close my eyes to what was happening. That night I decided to do what I should have done much earlier. I started checking every corner of the house. All the rooms were familiar, but in each of them I began to look for something hidden that could explain my fears. I looked in every closet, opened every door, even checked the old attic rooms. Everything looked quite ordinary, and yet the feeling of presence did not leave me. With each step in the empty and dark rooms of the house, I became more and more convinced that this was not just a figment of my imagination. When I entered the storage room where the old things were kept, I was truly overcome with fear. Cardboard boxes, old bags, folded blankets, all of it was lying in disarray. I went further into the room, illuminating the space with a flashlight, and noticed something flashing in the corner. It was an old mirror fragment. I came closer and, bending down a little, saw a reflection on it. For a moment I froze. The mirror was cracked, but what really surprised me was the dark shadow standing in the reflection behind my shoulders. I turned around sharply, but there was no one in the room. The tremors in my hands continued. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Everything in the house suddenly felt alien and hostile, and inside me a strange feeling grew that I had lost control. Everything that was happening seemed to push me toward a break with reality. I felt myself losing confidence in my own abilities. I realized that I had to do something. I didn't know what yet, but now I was certain I couldn't stay in this house. Perhaps it wasn't just me who needed to leave. Perhaps this house needed something or someone. And all these strange events, these sounds, shadows, reflections, none of this was accidental. I decided that tomorrow, despite my anxiety, I would need to talk to someone who could understand me. But what exactly was I going to tell them? About the strange sounds? About the reflection in the mirror? About how the house seemed to be filled with something alive, constantly watching me? I didn't know how to explain these feelings, but I had to do something. I couldn't stay in this eclipse of loneliness and fear without knowing what was behind it. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. It was as clear as day. I had this nagging feeling that something was happening here that I couldn't understand. I couldn't trust my eyes anymore. I couldn't tell where reality ended and fantasy began. All those shadows, sounds, smells, they had become part of my life, a part that I didn't know how to deal with. That night I decided to stay somewhere else. Although the idea of returning to the city and finding temporary housing seemed reasonable, I knew I needed to figure this out before leaving forever. I couldn't let these invisible forces win, so I found myself on the balcony, looking out at the dark forest. Suddenly, a thought occurred to me. If all these things were happening here, then maybe they had some connection to this place, to those forests that surrounded my home. If this wasn't a coincidence, if this wasn't just a figment of my mind, then there had to be a way to unlock the secret of this house. I remembered the talk I'd heard about the house when I'd first arrived. People in the village had spoken of it with some caution. They'd said that the place had once belonged to a family that hadn't been seen for a long time. Some had claimed that strange things had happened here decades ago, and now I had to face it. I decided to take all the necessary things the next morning and go to the local archive. I needed to find out more about the past of this house and its owners. Maybe there I will find at least some traces that could explain what is happening. But when I returned home, this feeling of being watched grew stronger. With every step in the house, it seemed as if something was following me. Something in the house itself, as if its walls were alive and watching my every move. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't stay here for long. Everything around me was alien and hostile. That night, I decided to go out onto the balcony again, but this time I couldn't stay quiet. I felt something strange in the air, as if the night itself was becoming ominous. The cold wind seemed dull, and the sky was covered with thick clouds. My fingers tightened around the railing when I heard the sound. It wasn't just a rustling sound like usual. It was a distinct step, a step that sounded too loud to be normal. I turned around, but no one was there. Then I knew I couldn't just leave. The house was a part of me, and maybe I was a part of it. I headed to the storeroom again. This time, I was determined. I knew I had to find an answer. I opened an old box that was in the corner and was surprised to find several old diaries. They were in handwritten notes. They weren't just notes. They were stories. Stories about those who lived here, about what they had experienced. But among these notes, I noticed one, written in a later handwriting than all the others. It began with the phrase, "Don't go out at night if you hear footsteps." My heart sank. I felt a chill run down my spine, but it got worse. The next line said, "They always come back, and they know who you are." Those words resonated in my soul. I didn't know who could have written those notes, but one thing was clear to me. I wasn't the first person to encounter that house. My heart began to pound as I continued reading. It spoke of strange creatures, of how they lurked in the shadows and darkness of the night, and most importantly, of how they came to those who were alone and who dared to seek answers. I closed the journal, unsure of what to do next, but one thought stayed with me. I couldn't leave this place until I found out what was really going on, no matter what I had to find out. This house and I were connected by something much deeper than just walls and a roof, and I was ready to face whatever lurked in its shadows. When I woke up, the morning light was filtering through the heavy curtains as if trying to obscure the dark thoughts that were bothering me. A strange feeling of uneasiness did not leave me. The night, despite its darkness and cold, did not disappear. The words I found in the diary sounded in my head. They always come back. This moment seemed to be stuck in my mind, and I did not know how to get rid of this feeling. I got up and decided to spend the day in the village. I needed answers, and the locals probably knew more than they were willing to say. Their silence had always been unsettling, and now I felt like they were hiding something important, something I needed to understand to make sense of what was going on. With each passing minute as I walked along the winding path towards the village, it became increasingly clear to me that this house was part of something deeper than I could have imagined. Everything around me seemed to be consumed by some shadow that followed me. The strange glances I caught in the reflections of shop windows, the fleeting rustles in the village streets, all this added up to one big, frightening feeling that someone was watching me. When I got to the local archives, I was met by an old lady who seemed to be keeping records of the house and its history. She looked like she knew more than she was letting on. I wasted no time in talking about the house's past, hoping she would give me at least a small clue. "This house is not simple," she said, not looking up from her notes. "It was built on an old cemetery. They say that not all the bodies were buried properly. Some things were left unsaid, unfinished." Her words hung in the air, and I felt the tension build. I asked who lived in the house and how long it had been empty. "There were several families," she answered, finally meeting my gaze. "But one day, several decades ago, they all disappeared. Since then, the house has stood empty, and no one has dared to return. And those who have tried have disappeared or simply gone crazy. The locals try to avoid it, and they probably do the right thing." She fell silent, and I felt that this was all she was prepared to answer. I thanked her and left the archive. But the feeling of anxiety grew stronger with each step. This place was connected with something otherworldly that could not be explained rationally. I returned to my home, but it was not a return, but rather a return to a trap, to a place that I could not leave now. That evening, when I found myself back within the walls of my home, I felt it again, a sense of presence, as if someone was nearby. Something elusive hung in the air, and I could hear the floorboards creaking on the second floor. But this time, I didn't avoid it. I decided to face what was haunting me. I struggled up to the second floor and found myself in a hallway where I had never felt safe before. Everything seemed distorted, as if the space itself was changing shape. I approached the door of one of the rooms and stopped, trying to listen to the sounds that were coming from behind it. The silence was almost deafening. But then I heard a soft, barely audible sound, like something scraping the floor. I opened the door. The room was dark, but in the center stood an old chair, and on the floor next to it was a strange, unnatural, dark veil. I bent down, trying to see what it was, when a shadow flashed in the darkness. It appeared and disappeared so quickly that I did not even have time to understand what exactly it was. My legs seemed not to obey me, and, seized by indescribable fear, I hurried out of the room. When I returned to my bedroom, I realized that this house had long since ceased to be just a building. It was a living being, thirsty for attention, and it seemed ready to reveal itself to me, no matter how hard I tried to avoid it. I knew one thing. The longer I stayed here, the more I became part of this shadow, this world I had never known before, and I couldn't leave until I figured out what was really going on within these walls. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows that had haunted me during the day didn't leave me in the dark. The room that had seemed safe and cozy now felt like a trap. I didn't know what the next day would bring, but I was sure it would be something important. There was too much left unexplained. The light from the lantern, barely penetrating through the window, created strange patterns on the walls. I sat on the bed, clutching the diary I had found in the closet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important hidden in it. The pages were covered with almost invisible notes that seemed to make no sense, but I needed to find at least some clue. I delved into the journal again. Some entries were years old, others decades old, but they were all intertwined by a common theme. People disappearing from their homes, strange events, whispers in the night. In one of the entries, I found a name that was familiar to me, the names of the previous owners of the house. I knew that among them were those who had disappeared and those who, for reasons unknown, had left this place. The reading became increasingly intense. The last entry, written almost 20 years ago, had said, "The dark forces do not leave people alone. We must leave. This is not a place for the living." The words echoed in my mind. I knew I could not simply ignore them. This house seemed to be more than just an old building. It was part of something that defied explanation. I stood up and went to the window. There was no movement in the night air. The streets were empty, as always, but something in their emptiness seemed alive. It became difficult for me to breathe, as if the air was saturated with something invisible. I felt my gaze automatically move to the house across the street. There, in the darkness, I saw movement. The figure standing in the window did not move. I froze. That was the moment when I realized I was not alone. The feeling was so strong that I wanted to go out and check who or what it was, but I knew that if I took a step, it would be impossible to go back. Suddenly, the figure in the window disappeared, as if it had never existed. My heart started beating faster, and I quickly moved away from the window. I couldn't let myself go crazy. I had to figure out what was going on here before it was too late. The next morning, I decided that I needed to learn more about the house's past, so I went to the local librarian. In this village, knowledge of the past was passed down orally, and even the oldest books could be useful. I didn't know what exactly I was missing, but I felt that somewhere there was an answer that would open my eyes. The library was small but cozy enough. It smelled of old books, and the silence that reigned in the room reinforced the feeling that something very important was kept here. I approached the librarian, a middle-aged woman who was familiar with every corner of the place. She looked at me curiously. "Do you need something?" she asked. I told her about the house, what was bothering me, and asked for help in finding information about its past. "This house," she paused, as if trying to find the right words. "This place has long had a bad reputation. The locals try not to remember it, but if you want to know what happened, you should look in books that not everyone dares to open." She led me to a separate section where rare books and old records were kept. I began to leaf through the pages of old chronicles and notes, and among them there was one book that immediately caught my attention. The title page was almost erased, but I made out the title, "Shadows Over the Lands." There was something familiar about it. I knew that the answer was hidden in this title. The book described strange events that took place in the vicinity of the village, connected with ancient rituals and forces that could not be spoken of out loud. Ancient magic, dark creatures that existed parallel to people. All this was contained in this book, but told in such a way that it seemed as if reality itself was distorted on the pages. With every word I read, it became harder and harder to breathe. I began to understand that the history of the house I lived in was connected to something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. The shadows of the past I had tried to forget did not leave me, and I felt their influence enveloping me more and more. When I got home, it felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I felt like something invisible was watching my every move. The dark forces I had read about were real, and they were coming for me. The day was quiet and almost mundane, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything that was happening around me was just preparation for something bigger. And yet, despite my desperate attempts to concentrate, I couldn't get the nightmare out of my head that haunted me every night, and that grew more vivid with each passing day. My hand instinctively reached for the journal, and I began to read the entries again, trying to find even a small part of the answers that could explain what was happening. Each page, each passage seemed to contain more questions than answers. There was a riddle in them that I could not solve. Everything was in a jumble in my head: magic, paranormal phenomena, disappearances. These elements, as if intertwined into one ball, did not give me peace. And now, having in my hands almost everything that could help me understand exactly what happened, I again felt despair creeping up on me. I knew that the only way to find answers was to research the history of this house and its previous owners. Suddenly, I remembered the librarian's story. She said that this house was not just a building, it was a place where time and space changed their usual laws. I realized that I had not been looking for information for a long time. I was looking for a way to find the key that would reveal this whole mystical picture. Gathering my courage, I decided to visit the house again and try to understand what exactly was wrong with it. The only thing I lacked was courage, but maybe this time I could find the answers I was missing. I felt like I needed to understand the past of this place so I wouldn't become a part of it. When I arrived, the sky was covered with gray clouds and fog enveloped the house as if it were trying to hide from the world. I walked inside and immediately felt the cold and tension gripping every cell of my body. The walls were silent as always, but I knew something was wrong. I went to the basement, where, according to rumors, things belonging to previous owners were stored. Perhaps there were some clues or hiding places that were not visible at first glance. The path there was dark and difficult, With each step, I felt the weight of this place pressing down on me. The old wooden floors creaked under my fingernails, and every movement seemed to disturb the already fragile peace. The basement was cold and damp. The smell of mold and stale air immediately filled my lungs. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the shelves filled with old crates and boxes. I began to check them, hoping to find something that might shed light on what was going on here. In one of the boxes, deeply hidden under tons of old things, I found a small wooden box. It was covered in dust and looked quite ancient. I carefully opened it, feeling a premonition brewing inside. Inside were old photographs and a letter, worn out by time. There were people in the photographs I didn't know, but they all seemed connected to this place. They looked at the camera, but their eyes were empty, lifeless, as if they knew something they weren't telling. On the back of one photograph was a note, faded but still legible: "They will never leave. The shadows follow us." My heart sank. What did this mean? Why such words? I clutched the letter, and the thought came to me again. I must understand what was hidden behind this house. I could not allow myself to leave everything unanswered. I quickly unfolded the letter and began to read. The letter described how people who were obsessed with finding immortality through dark rituals once lived here. They tried to break the boundaries between worlds, but what they freed became their curse. The house, the letter said, was not just a building. It was a place where two worlds crossed. The dark forces they had awakened now owned this place, and according to the letter, they did not let go of anyone who set foot on this land. With every word, I became more and more afraid. I knew that I couldn't just leave. This house, its history, its curse, all of it wouldn't let me go. My mind was filled with thoughts of how to get out of this trap, but I understood that now I couldn't bring everything back. I returned to my room, but the fear did not leave me. This whole story was only the beginning. I understood that I still had much to learn, and every step I take brings me closer to solving what is hidden in the darkness of this house. I woke up in the middle of the night as if someone invisible was standing next to me and watching me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like every movement was turning into a hard fight with what was tormenting me inside. My strength was leaving me, and despite the fact that I tried to disconnect from everything that was happening, every corner of my mind was filled with terrible thoughts. Opening my eyes, I saw that the room was shrouded in fog. It wasn't just night light, it was something more. The twilight light, like fog coming through the windows, felt ominous. It wasn't natural. I got out of bed and went to the window, trying to see what was happening outside, but there was only impenetrable darkness behind the glass. As time went on, I began to doubt whether this light was real. Perhaps it was all part of my nightmares, those strange visions that I could not explain. However, something in my inner world made me doubt it. Something was wrong here. I went back to my notes, remembering everything I had found so far. Reading the diary and the letter from the basement haunted me, especially when I thought about the words written on the photographs. Shadows follow us. These words haunted me like an invisible shadow, and I felt them penetrating my soul more and more, confusing my mind. Shadows. They could mean many things. But what exactly were they hiding? What did they symbolize? Perhaps this was not just a metaphor for spirits, but something much darker, and I, more than anyone, had to decipher this meaning before I was completely consumed by what surrounded me. That night I couldn't sleep. The hours dragged on endlessly, and I, not knowing what to do with myself, decided to go down to the basement. Maybe there I would find another clue, or at least something that would help me understand what was happening. The house was dead and quiet, but there was something deceptive about it. It was as if I felt something looking at me, something burning me with its gaze. The basement greeted me with its cold darkness, as always. It was so quiet in this place that you could hear the time dripping in the silence, like water dripping from the ceiling. I turned on the light and, clutching the old lamp, slowly walked between the shelves where the dug-up things lay. Something in one corner caught my eye. It was a small stone altar covered in dust. It seemed like it had always been there, but I had never noticed it before. My hands shook as I walked closer and noticed strange runes carved into the stone. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. With each step I took, I felt the tension in the room grow. I was cold, and I knew something was about to happen. My fingers carefully touched those runes. At that moment, The air around me began to vibrate, and I felt something activate. Dark shapes began to gather in the corners of the basement. I tried to retreat, but my feet seemed to be glued to the floor. Flashes of strange light began to illuminate the runic symbols, and they began to glow red, making me feel like I was not alone in this basement, as if someone was standing behind me. "You shouldn't be here," a whisper sounded in my ears. I turned around, but saw no one. Everything around me was alien and incomprehensible. I felt time slowing down, the light from the runes continued to flicker, and I couldn't understand what was happening. Everything around me became unbearably heavy, as if space itself was beginning to distort. And then I understood. What I had seen was not just a mirage, it was a trace of what had once happened here. Shadows of the past, forgotten rituals, spirits that could not find peace. All of this was now part of my world, my home. The dark figures began to approach, slowly and inexorably. I felt their presence, but I could not explain why I could not move. Every breath I took was difficult, and I realized that something was pulling me into this dark abyss. But try as I might, I couldn't contain the terror that gripped me. I realized that at that moment, it didn't matter what I had learned or what I had to do. I was trapped, and it might already be too late. With every step in the darkness, I began to realize that I was now part of this history, part of what was hidden in the shadows of the past.